kick things off, I'm going to be talking about strategy and as a brand, what can we be thinking about to help us thrive in this post-digital world? Why do we exist here? What keeps us relevant? Why should people care about us? First, I'll be explaining where this idea of post-digital comes from, and then looking at some habits of forward-thinking brands. This talk of post-digital might not be what you want to hear at the moment. You might have more urgent needs. You know, in brand marketing, we seem to be in a constant state of fear at the moment in sometimes. And I think we see the digital world as being one of upheaval and constant flux. I think it can be confusing to know how to keep up and what to do. I think our job as a brand agency working in this space is to try and look beyond what's going on around us and not to get too caught up in specific platforms and technologies. We need to take a long-term view based on principles which we can adapt. And we really believe it's ideas that get people excited, it's great content that engages them, and it's the context that those are delivered in that decides how effective it's going to be. But to do that, we need to be well-versed and know what's possible from the tools we've got available. Then we can make informed decisions about whether a technology is the best vehicle for what we're doing or whether it's in danger of becoming the idea. That's why we started to think about this idea of post-digital. We want to start making sense of where things are going, to develop strategies that prepare our clients for what comes next. And in many ways, we're well on our way there. Now that innovation and connectivity are a given and part of the everyday world, we shouldn't really be too surprised by the pace of change. I think we should accept it and think about how it can work for us and, more importantly, how it can work for our audiences. Post-digital isn't really a new idea. We've started to think about it recently when we think about the way certain brands behave, but then we discovered it had actually been floating around in art circles for some years. Russell Davis, the strategist and writer, first coined it in relation to tech entrepreneurship in 2009, and still had to explain what he meant by it for a couple of years later. And this is what he was asking: what will we do when we can take all this connectivity for granted and it's no longer special or interesting? What will we build then? And Russell was talking about moving beyond interaction with the devices that we know now into creating things that are more personal. So he was talking about experimenting with things like Arduino, the computing platform that senses and controls the physical world that we've seen over with the Technology Will Save Us kits. And, you know, we can see this around us here, like this move from keyboards to touchscreens, from graphic user interfaces to natural user interfaces. You can see it in wearable tech and prototypes like Leap Motion, Google Glass, and now Microsoft's HoloLens as well. So the digital world is coming off the 2D screen and coming more into the real world, actually becoming more analog and more tactile. Alan Turing's credited with this quote back in the 50s: being digital should be more interesting than just being electronic. And again, he's hinting at something more human, something beyond screens and keyboards, and this was 60 years ago. And now we're moving to the Internet of Things, which extends connectivity into everyday objects like security, heating systems, home entertainment, cars, wearable tech. Now, to me, the Internet of Things is a bit of a daft phrase, I think. It's something we'll look back on and perhaps be a bit embarrassed about in years to come. It feels like the Victorians calling steam trains iron horses or something. But it is an important stage because we're starting to understand now that desktop computers, then laptops, phones, tablets, games consoles are really just the first things that are going to be connected, and everything that can be connected, it will be. I think to illustrate that, there's currently 7 billion connected devices in the world. Within the next decade, I think it's going to be 50 billion. While a lot of that means smartphones in developing countries and regions, it also means just a lot more things being connected. So I think in the same way that we're understanding that our technology is transient, we're also realising that the brands that need to use that technology aren't finished products either. They need to be sort of constantly in development and beta. I think whereas old school branding was about designing every eventuality up front, now we need to be much more flexible. We know we just can't do that, so we need different systems. Post-digital doesn't mean we're nearing the end of the digital revolution, far from it. I mean, we think of it in the way that we might use postmodern, which was a reaction to the overly austere nature of some aspects of modernism, but it built on modernist principles. And in this case, it takes what we've learned and makes it more aligned to human behaviour. So that's why the internet's really started to come to life with the advent of social media. The social web took networks that were constructed largely around one-way communication and rebuilt them around human behaviour, echoing, sometimes amplifying the way that we act online. I think the next step is becoming really comfortable with this always-on connectivity and integrating that into our everyday life. Although we're not quite there yet, if anything, we're only just starting to realise how much things are going to change. And this current period that we're going through feels quite sort of crazy because we're right in the middle of a revolution, and it's hard to see beyond that. But it is going to level off, even if the next curve isn't far behind. If you look at the cycles of innovation through history, you see these waves developing, making great advances, and then becoming commonplace before something newer kicks in. And you can also see how the rate of change increases as well, accelerates. And so, as most of us have lived through probably like two of these waves, we can't help but make comparisons with what we knew before, which is sometimes helpful, but most often it's not, because we're comparing the past to a different future. And we also forget that we've seen this kind of upheaval many times before. The world has seen this kind of change a lot before. Writing in The Guardian last year, Tom Goodwin likened it to what we're going through now with the advent of electricity. He said that electricity was a transformational element that could change everything, but only when applied at the core. So at the end of the 19th century, it actually took 20 years for electricity to put at the heart of business, rather than just used as an add-on. So up until then, electricity was being used to light up factories, but for them to still do what they were doing before with steam-powered machines, but working into the night, lit by electricity. And it was only when the factories actually got rethought around electric machinery and production lines that things started to really change. And that sort of feels like where we are now, moving towards this constant connectivity, which is what we want brands to be ready for. So when digital is like at the core of everything, how will people behave and how are brands going to behave? These do apply digital at the core. Obviously, Airbnb's opened up a completely new way to travel, cuts out the need for hotels and travel companies. It's connecting people who have an asset to people who need that asset. But more than that, they're trying to create an experience of being somewhere as a local rather than as a tourist, and creating a community sort of built around a common idea. So in a way, it's a move back to a more traditional way of dealing with each other. And this is disrupting whole categories and starting to change the way people behave, which is scary for us, because we see people starting to remove traditional brands from their lives and replace them with something new. So what does this mean? How do we stay relevant in this world? What are the opportunities? Is a brand becoming something new? I think to answer that, we just need to go back to an essential definition of what a brand actually is. Obviously, there's loads of ways to describe it. This is a very good one. Your brand is what people say when you're not in the room. It reminds us that we don't really own the brand. It exists as an idea in people's minds. And your brand is still what people say when you're not in the room. It's just that there's so many different rooms. Everyone has an immediate opinion, and they can spread that far and wide before you have a chance to respond to it. So where you've never really owned your brand, now you really, really don't own your brand. It's out there. I think going a bit deeper on this idea of brand, for me, Robert Jones of Wolf Ollins defines it more accurately than anyone. He talks about a brand being a set of ideas in people's minds that are shaped by their actions and recognised by a visual and verbal style. I think this is a really practical way to think about a brand. A set of ideas tells us why something exists and what it stands for. And in a moment, I'll be looking at ways you can build a brand through ideas. Then how do those ideas drive the actions of the brand? And what sort of things will it make and do? And that's what Dave's going to be looking at in the second talk. And then how do we recognise the style of the brand across multiple channels, networks and touch points? And that's what Dan's going to be looking at in the third talk, or maybe I will. If you're bored of my voice now, you'll be really bored after another hour. So just to come back to the ideas, the ways that a brand should be thinking now. For us, the key principle is that post-digital means being human, and being more human means really being led by ideas, because that's what people are interested in, ideas and stories. That's how they respond well. So we need to use the strategy as a system to help guide what we do in a more human way. And I'm going to be looking at 5 simple ways to be more post-digital, or to be more human as a brand, with some examples of people that are doing that well, sometimes where it's not quite working. I think perhaps the most important thing for a brand to have is a sense of purpose, particularly in a kind of changing world where what you do and make can change. This is sometimes explained as the fundamental reason you exist beyond making money. And communicating your purpose helps people to really understand why you do what you do. It allows you to be constant despite whatever else is changing. And this one's probably not much of a surprise because it's what everyone's been talking about for a while. Years ago, Simon Sinek famously used the example of Microsoft, where they talk about what they do and Apple talk about why they do it, to think differently, to challenge the status quo. And that can be really powerful for people to align to a brand. And if our job is to try and get people to align to tribes, then that is a really important way to do that. Method is a US brand that makes cleaning products that are kinder to the environment. And obviously, though they talk about this as an important part of what they do, the brand organises itself around this idea of people against dirty. So as a purpose, people against dirty is very inclusive. It makes customers feel part of the brand, and it makes the brand one of the people as well. There's a trend at the moment for brands to align themselves with a bigger cause or a bigger ideal. And this is great when it's relevant, but really customers care about what you're going to do for them. And you know, that's what we should be concentrating on, unless it's relevant to think bigger. I think at a time when the products you make and the services you offer can evolve so much, it's essential to have a clear purpose. But it's also important for that purpose to align with a human behaviour rather than a specific technology. A good example of this is Kodak, whose business was obviously built around photographic film and processing. And by the 70s, Kodak had 90% market share of film processing in the States. But they were slow to adapt to the advent of digital cameras, even though the core technology in many of those digital cameras was devised by Kodak. So, you know, for the past 20 years, they've flirted with various degrees of bankruptcy and ended up selling a lot of its patents to people like Apple, Google, Facebook a few years ago, just to give you a kind of stark contrast between old and new. And now Kodak's back launching its first smartphone, aimed as being a budget competitor to the iPhone and obviously marketing itself on the strength of its camera. But they still feel like a company trying to catch up, trying to find its footing with the technology in a changed landscape. It's perhaps a bit unfair, but if you compare that with Instagram, in 2010, Instagram launched with a blog post announcing their aim to make mobile photos fast, simple and beautiful. So nothing more or less than that. But the important thing is this was born out of a response to 3 complaints that users had with mobile photography. My mobile photos look lame, it's a pain to share them with friends, photos take forever to upload and viewing them is slow. So the app was built around helping people to do these 3 things easily and really well. And because the images are shareable across all social platforms, it's easy for them to adapt and grow and not become obsolete. And the value of Instagram to Facebook now is estimated at $35 billion. So it's worth aligning with people's needs and natural behaviours, the things that they want to do rather than a particular technology or process. Of course, purpose goes hand in hand with values. These are principles, what we believe in and what we couldn't live without. Values also attract people to more human brands because they provide distinction between you and the rest. As the great ad man Bill Bernbach said, your principles aren't principles until they cost you money. So the magic of values or principles is that they're not really about gaining a commercial advantage, actually quite the opposite. But in having them and living them, you find your point of difference. Patagonia is probably one of the most principled brands there is. Founded by a group of climbers in 1973, it's built around the values-based mission to build the best products while causing no unnecessary environmental harm. It's not just a set of well-meaning words. Patagonia is registered as a benefit corporation, meaning it legally binds itself to its commitment to the environment. And obviously they acknowledge that what they do does impact the environment, but as part of this, they developed this online tool called the Footprint Chronicles, where they assess how they're doing. They call it they say they show the good and bad of the supply chain. So they're obviously proud to talk about a story about having a traceable supply of duck down with no ill treatment to animals. But equally, if they sell a pair of shorts that has no recyclable material because it would be too expensive to do it, they'll sell them and they'll tell people, look, we weren't able to make these recyclable. You decide whether you buy them or not. So it's a bit like going to a job interview and saying, your only fault is you're a perfectionist. But I think it is important because it shows an acceptance of not being perfect and of trying to do the right thing and trying to improve, which is a human quality that people really admire and aspire to themselves. And because everything's out there, it projects this culture of honesty, of having nothing to hide. Of course, the flip side of living your values is that in the modern world, there's no back of house. Your brand isn't just what you say, but also what you do. And you can't talk one way but behave another. You have to be true to your values inside and out. And that means treatment of staff, suppliers, customers, all demonstrates the way you really are. American Apparel makes a big deal out of the fact that they're sweatshop free, that everyone works for minimum, at least minimum wage in their LA factory. They also allow staff to make free international calls during work times. And, they say all of this makes their workforce more motivated, which is all fantastic and should be applauded. But values should be compatible as well. They should make sense as a whole. And that's not really the story that American Apparel is known for. Their ad campaigns are regularly attacked for the way they objectify women. They employ dubiously young-looking models. If you add to that the constantly sort of sleazy revelations about the CEO, Dov Charney, there's a real disconnect there with treating people decently, I think. Charney was actually sacked at the end of last year, but the company's lost hundreds of millions over the past couple of years for bad commercial decisions, but also because of this bad PR that's kind of they've got embroiled in. So you can't really take the moral high ground in one area, but be completely amoral in the other. It just doesn't really work. You can't really expect people to hear just the message that you want them to hear. And that's largely because relationships are a two-way thing. Real relationships are a two-way thing. So however much people like to think they make rational decisions, we are all emotive creatures and we naturally identify with groups. Brands have always needed ways to support this emotional decision-making, to give powerful reasons to join our clubs. But the blind brand loyalty of the past that could be hammered home by repeating an ad slogan is something that perhaps made brands quite lazy. In the socially driven world, advertising is seen more and more as a last resort or a smaller part of the brand building mix. This sort of one-way conversation becomes less relevant because people are increasingly interested in getting involved with brands and making them their own. So this is obviously true in various crowdfunding sites like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Crowdfunder, where people literally have a stake in getting a project started. I had to put a picture of a hoverboard in because we're in the Flux Lounge. No hoverboard yet, Ian. But it's about all brands being more collaborative and more consultative. So as with the Instagram example, it's about finding out what people are interested in and what they're having problems with and responding to that. And that means two-way communication and co-creation, not just broadcasting. So love them or hate them, brands like Starbucks have learned from this. And my Starbucks idea is a kind of suggestion box with a huge shot of caffeine, I suppose. Customers can submit ideas, everyone votes for them, which is, it's quite a simple mechanic, but it gives everyone a tiny say in the future of Starbucks. And if you're a fan of that brand, that matters to you. We talk about modern brands being always on, but I wonder if it's more just a case of actually just always being there for people and providing a framework for conversations that can run on their own. And I think this new idea of brands being content creators can lead to some quite dry stuff, but sometimes a brilliant idea spreads way beyond potential customers. Last year, Google talked about their recommended approach to content strategy on YouTube, Hero, Hub and Hygiene. Has anyone not heard of Hero, Hub and Hygiene? It's going to be old hat to people, isn't it? I'll go through it quite quickly. The best known example they give is what Volvo Trucks did last year. So their hero piece of content was obviously Jean-Claude Van Damme's epic split, which has been watched by 77 million people on YouTube so far. most of whom probably aren't that interested in buying a Volvo truck. But it's not really the point, because it gets them talked about, it associates them with something funny and quite a spectacular piece of content. But the real hard work, the sort of heavy lifting, is done by the hub content, Brian's Truck Reports, which are sort of low-budget, informative films that are uploaded regularly to Volvo's YouTube channel. These still get tens of thousands of views, and they're more likely to be truck drivers or people in the market to buy a truck. And then the hygiene content takes place in the comments below that, where people can give their feedback and know it's going to be listened to. So, you get the constant commenting nonsense as anywhere on YouTube, but Volvo do get a stream of interesting and useful dialogue that they can use to plan future content, but more importantly, to really understand what their people want. So it becomes a genuine conversation. With brands starting to learn to act like publishers, Hero, Hub and Hygiene is really useful, but as pointed out in a Guardian media blog last month, still February, isn't it? It's an idea straight from traditional magazines, where the hero content is the cover, which draws people in, the hub content is the articles, and the hygiene content is the letters page, where you have your chance to have your say. So it's another example of how the web is starting to behave more how people want naturally, rather than the way it's built. And it's another way of sharing your point of view, which is an important thing to have. Human brands shouldn't be neutral. They should really inspire people through their opinions. I don't think it's enough just to hijack conversations with chit-chat. Being authentic means having a believable point of view on a category or on life in general. And it's also about mixing that up a little bit. Joe Stitzlin from Google's Brand Studio says, it's our job to establish a pattern that our audience can recognise, but it's our duty to break it up once in a while. And I think it's also knowing how far to reach from your heartland before you start coming across as insincere. So Coca-Cola is a brand whose open happiness proposition seems to be morphing into a crusade against the cynicism of the web at the moment. The Share a Coke campaign they did was a brilliant idea that turned the people into media and gave them a platform to spread Coke's message as well as their own. And it shows if you give people the right tools and provide enough meaning for them themselves, then they'll quite happily become the media. Even though it's years old, Share a Coke still gets about 50,000 social mentions a day. So it's out there, that digital footprint's out there, and it just starts the ball rolling. And Coke does a great job of mixing user-generated content with their own on their happiness Tumblr as well. It starts to sort of blur the lines between the brand owners and the brand believers. So they're doing everything right in terms of sharing their brand, owning and supporting this idea of happiness. But I don't know, with Coke, there's a kind of nasty taste somewhere, because we know stories about the way they've treated workers and retailers in the past. And I feel that we know a bit too much about Coke as the biggest brand in the world to just take wide-eyed happiness at face value. I think if being authentic is about inspiring opinion on a category, then Lurpak have been really on their game recently with their campaigns from Whedon and Kennedy. There's just a classic sense of craft to these campaigns. It's like great photography, brilliant copywriting, really inspiring ads. And it feels like a genuine insight into real life there as well, in the language and the celebration of imperfection. They're not doing anything wildly out there, but they maintain their social channels well. They make great content, and they've built this friendly, competitive community around Bake Club, and thinking about what it is that people want to do and providing tools for them to be able to do it. And I think it's probably just it's this human connection, this attachment to the real world that makes everything work well for me. And I think that tone really allows them to push their ads too and make heroes out of everyday people and objects.
Tonight, as we stand on the edge of possibility, tonight we choose adventure. Who can say what the journey might throw at us? But we've conquered puffy things, bony things, bottom-of-the-sea things. With Lurpak by our side, we will scoop. And tonight, that will be our dinner. Cooks, venture forth with new Lurpak Cooks range. Bony things,
I just think that's really fun. I think, the power of being authentic is when you feel you own a category, you can be that playful with it, and that keeps you at the centre of people's minds.
That is our
And
destiny.
that's obviously what it's all about. Brands need to stay relevant, either by entertaining or by being useful, or ideally both. And being useful means solving people's problems, however small they might be. So we've seen over the past decade or so that old business models won't remain if they can be disrupted or if they're not in the customer's interest. This is obvious in the move from ownership to subscription models like Spotify, Netflix, Office 365. And, people are becoming more comfortable with this idea of not owning things, but just having access to them. And anything that can be improved this way, I think, will be. So, we've seen a move from established commercial transactions to peer-to-peer transactions like Airbnb and Uber, Etsy. Zipcar and others are doing the same thing with car sharing, connecting people who have a need with people who have an unused asset. So, how many times you've walked down a commuter street and seen it just a car park during the day? And I think when we can see something isn't right, that we know it's probably ripe for getting rethought pretty soon. I'd be surprised if car ownership is still the norm in 20 years. I think it's something that many cities are already starting to move away from. And, it's something where we can just see that kind of old thinking moving to new thinking quite soon. And we talked about ways of kind of always being there for people. One of the ways of being relevant is to be servile as a brand, to give people something before they realise they even need it, which is where smart use of data can come in. I'm not going to talk about data as in how do we target people, but just more how can we give people something more. In the world of the super rich, it's normal to have people around to second guess your every need, to kind of concierge your life, I suppose. And with the use of mobile technology, beacons and sensors, that world of luxury is going to be available to all of us. So a really mainstream example of this is Magic Band at Disney. That's a wristband that connects with My Disney Experience, where holidaymakers plan their selections in advance, fast passes for rides, dining reservations, entertainment options. They receive their Magic Bands in advance of the trip, building excitement, adding another layer of anticipation to the trip before they go. And I think this is the way things are going to be going, like bringing more magic and luxury to the everyday. I think, wearable technology still feels like a novelty at the moment for us. We're trying to find uses for it, perhaps. We tend to think of how it enhances sports performance and monitoring, like with these Ralph Lauren shirts, the smart shirts that were launched at the US Open. But it's going to find a much more valuable role in protecting us as well. This is Stan Larkin from Michigan, who last month was the first person ever to leave hospital without a human heart. So, the machine he's got strapped to him doesn't look like much. It's not the most discreet bit of kit, but it's keeping him alive out of hospital while he waits for a heart transplant. He's sort of fueled by, obviously, the mechanics and the data that's feeding back into it as well. And looking ahead, the medical secretary of the NHS has said that wearable tech plays a vital role in the future of the NHS. He imagines a time when someone with heart disease is sat at home being monitored by discrete sensors on a watch or a plaster or something like that. And then days before he has any noticeable symptoms, he gets a call from the doctors or the hospital saying, you're going back into heart failure. Someone's going to be there in half an hour to give you some drugs and you'll be fine. And all of this before there's any symptoms shown. So I think when an organisation like the NHS says their future depends on wearable technology, I think we all need to start taking that seriously. So those are my 5 habits of post-digital brands. Have a purpose, live your values, build two-way relationships, strive for authenticity, and be useful to stay relevant. And overall, remember that being post-digital means being more human, and being more human means being led by ideas. Thank you.